One of the things I've learned in being a part of the mental health organization is that things rarely simplify to an easy either or, but I would say Iraq was a very significant presence in my mind that I was working extremely hard not only to ignore, but not to acknowledge altogether. I started group therapy at Fort Leonard Wood was like 3 or 4 years after I got back. Before that, I wasn't willing to admit any problem at all. And after I got out of the military, I bounced back and forth between whether or not I wanted to take the medications that they had prescribed me, whether I was going to be a part of any kind of counseling paradigm, whether I thought it was something I needed now that I wasn't confronted with the military all the time. A lot of it aligned down to the fact that until I was willing to admit a persistent presence of something other than myself in my head, that I wasn't ready to rebuild anything of myself.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today's guest is Staff Sergeant Loran Osborne, USA retired, a medically retired Army veteran, served in both the Navy and Army, including deployment during OIF 09 to 11. Since 2019, he has been an accredited American Legion Veteran Service Officer and holds a summa cum laude bachelor's in communications with a focus on veteran outreach from Colorado Christian University. Loran helped establish the Service Member, Veteran, and Family Dependent Program at Fort County Mental Health Center and holds certifications in mental health case management, peer support, and as a SAMHSA certified peer support specialist for military affiliated populations. He is a community Green Zone instructor trainer and has served as post-service officer for 2 American Legion posts and 1 VFW post. Loran is also an active member of the executive board for Southeast Kansas Veteran Providers Coalition and the SMVF subcommittee of the Kansas Governor's Behavioral Health Services Commission. Loran, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And if there's one word or a few words you could use to describe how you are feeling going into this episode today, how would you describe that?
I would say charged up, engaged.
Love that.
I want to see benefits happen for people. So.
Yeah. I think the thing that sticks out to me the most when I read your bio is just how much passion there is there for not only veterans, but also mental health. I mean, there's a lot there. And I know a bio is like scratching the surface, right? Because you don't get to really like see or hear everything. And so I'm really excited to learn more about your story. So I'm going to pass it off to you to just share a little bit more with the listeners about who you are, where you came from, what you've done, and a little bit more about what you're doing today.
All right. Well, I want to start off first by saying, first and foremost, without any shame whatsoever, I am an unapologetic Christian. I'm also a father and a husband. I've been married for about 28 years now, and I have 6 children, and we're raising 2 of my grandchildren right now. I started out as, well, pretty much everybody else does. Just I didn't have all my oars in the water, and I spun in different circles. And when I landed in the military, most of my male family had been in the military, some females, and they had all given me advice on what kind of direction I would get there, and it was all different advice. So I wasn't prepared to engage in that quite yet. And then some things happened through the passing of my father and everything that led me to believe that I had a purpose or a place there to help people. So I joined the military at 21. I joined the Navy. And because my father passed away from poor aviation maintenance, my thought process was to go to one of the best aviation maintenance schools in the United States, which happened to be Naval Air Training Center, Pensacola, Florida. And after I completed there in the top of my class, I went on to be part of some really cool programs that landed me in one of the last places you'd ever expect to see the Navy. I was stationed at Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma, on 9/11 when that went off, and my middle son was born the night before. So that was an interesting, fun time. But that's about as far away from either shore as you can get. And the only reason that really worked out is because it was a strategic communications platform that had to be present on both coasts. So Oklahoma is equidistant. Well, after I was there for a while, I went through a few different things, and then I like to tell people the story of when I was re-enlisting for the second time and getting ready to come up on orders for the second time. And JAS was popping out all kinds of cool stuff from all over the place. And went to my career counselor, and he said, "So tell me, petty officer, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, just being kind of a smart aleck, when I grow up, I want to," and he says, "Well, let me stop you right there. You're going to have to change branches, son. Sailors don't grow up." So, long story short, a few things went a few different ways, and I ended up transitioning to Army aviation, where I served until Hurricane Katrina. Through the course of training and operations, I had some pretty significant damage to both of my knees, which took me out of flight status and put me on the ground as a logistician. So I operated people and trucks to move ammunition and water and distributed equipment to different places. I ran about 6 guys and was responsible for 8 trucks. And then they sent me to commo school. So I ran 80 radios, 6 trucks, or 8 trucks and 6 guys. And that was how I ended up in Iraq. They were just, as they were putting together piecemeal units from maneuver enhancement brigades, they grabbed a hold of the support brigade that we were a part of and dragged them over there in 2009. So, long story short, that speaks to who I've been and what I've been. I finished up my career as after I think about 9 surgeries to try and get my knees back into a place where I could continue serving, that got me close enough to where I could walk, but not where I was doing well. So they started med board process, and I finished out my last 2 years as an emergency operations sergeant, which gave me a lot of insight into the way that FEMA and some of the other emergency response and management companies did things, and sort of led to where my head went when I got out. What didn't lead was one of the reasons we developed a program called the Green Zone, and that was the employment you expect to get. You develop all of these significant licenses and these large hand receipts in the military that are worth hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. And at 25, you're carrying more responsibility than most 40-year-olds will carry in their entire life. And then you get out and you work at a Safeway. And you struggle to redefine yourself based upon this diminished perspective so that you don't believe that you've fallen in the world because you are so much less than you were. You go through a period where you almost idolize where you were in service. Now, this may be mainly for career military, because I know there are some military members, they get out, they run far, they run fast, and they don't even want to say the name of the service they were a part of afterwards. And other ones want to complain about how horrible it was until 10 years after they got out, and then they're on Facebook reminiscing about what an MRE tastes like. There's something pervasive about military culture that it both ensconces itself within your person and causes a revulsion for some of the things you were willing to accept or were willing to at least be okay with where you were at, that may reflect a real injury to your moral compass nowadays. So realigning that became kind of my purpose. I went through a brief period of time where we ran a veteran shelter for people that had substance abuse problems. That worked until, ironically, we got a hold of 2 soldiers who were formerly my soldiers at other commands. And they came to the house, and one of them refused to quit drinking, and the other one got caught with substances in the house. So they both got booted, and that pretty much was the end of that. I ended up schooling for my accreditation in the American Legion as a veteran service officer, and Then I started working on access to resources with the Governor's Challenge, and now that's what I do. I put service members, veterans, family members, and dependents together with resources, access, and even VA benefits into comprehensive packages and get them to places where they can see a resolution that doesn't include them living destitute and tired on a street corner. And then I reinvest them in their community so that they can do the same for somebody else. So I guess you could say I'm paying it behind instead of forward, because everybody that I impact, I try to make sure they impact somebody who is in the same position they used to be in.
I love that model. And I think that's how we build this web network structure that has been racking the brains of the government for so many years, of like, how do we create this impact, right? Is like, you have to teach other people to help the next person, right? Like the one person can't do it all. One organization can't do it all, but teaching other people to lift up the next person is absolutely brilliant. I wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously you do a lot in the mental health and the veteran space. Was there something specific that happened to you that made you decide that this was your passion, or how did it become your passion? I mean, how did you get to this space where you decided to dedicate so much of your life to these particular things?
I lost my family over and over again. My wife and I, of 28 years, have been divorced once and remarried. We've been separated 5 times. The children have been involved in most of those, and I've had to watch how that affected them, how that impacted not only their familial relationships, but their casual relationships, their educational relationships. I've seen some of my children endure adversity and rise. I've seen other of my children pack it in like a garbage compactor and fall and struggle over and over again to see themselves out of that trouble. And some of them are still struggling today. The ripples that come from the causative butterfly effect that is a failure to recognize mental health issues within oneself, they're never simple. There's a reason that they call it the military social complex. It's not because it is a complex that's interdependent and builds upon itself. That's a no brainer. Everybody knows that. The reason they call it complex is because it's layered, because it's thick, and because it has so many intertwined elements that it's like playing a mental health game of pickup sticks to pull apart the very one thing that may have triggered this change into each individual and who they became. And then that falling back to the military mental mindset that it doesn't matter if Joe, Bob, and Peter are the ones who screwed up. If Oz was the sergeant, it was Oz's fault. So now I'm watching all of these things happen and knowing that it goes back to my failure to hold accountability on myself. Now, did I make my wife go do things that caused us to have rifts? Did I make my kids get into fights at schools and stuff like that? No. Some of the things they saw and some of the things that they lived through may have influenced those decisions, but they're still decisions. And living in accountability nowadays, I know that. But while I'm taking that accountability, I need to reflect back at the fact that I was the guiding force and the leadership in my home. And that when cracks start appearing in the walls, it's because the leadership wasn't holding them together. So that's what refocused me from something that might have been a mission that was almost a little self-aggrandizing, like running a homeless shelter. I'm not saying everybody that runs one is, but for me, it was a personal reasons, and it made me feel good to do it. And so it was kind of self-benefiting to something that was greater or bigger than me.
Okay. And so the military social complex you talked about, can you explain what that is a little more for the listeners who have no idea what that is?
All right, the military social complex is a grouping of social cues and rules that don't really fit into normal or normative society. I mean, anymore when we've got people identifying a bunch of different ways, and we've got thought processes that strive to exceed normative factors. It's difficult to pin the tail on the normal donkey. But while you're doing that, you have to evaluate the fact that there's an entire subculture that sits over here that has come from thousands of different backgrounds worldwide with different ideals, different thought processes, and they've melded together into a mindset where dark humor, embracing the suck, all of those things, they become a meaning unto themselves. The ability to rise and fall in a career in a matter of months rather than a matter of years. The ability to get out of a brig, do something right, and then be in charge of a bunch of men doesn't exist out here. Most people get out of prison and then they struggle for most of the rest of their lives unless they have an avenue by which they can evolve themselves. And in the military, those kind of things happened often because while the mission was key, they understood that men and women made the mission, and you had to make the men and women that would be best for the mission out of whoever you happen to have.
Thank
And
you.
so that created a complex and layered way of molding human beings through a mixture of leadership, discipline, and frankly, derision.
Yeah.
That created a people capable of handling both emotional and physical storms.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. And you articulated that so well. I think for people listening that don't quite understand the difference between civilian and military, because I think there are people that do, there are a lot of people, mostly military, that are like, it's just a job. But when you talk about that, it kind of puts into perspective that side where it's a little more than just your standard job, right? Because there are rules and there are social aspects of it that are completely different, which I think speaks to, the wiring of the brain when one is serving in the military. I do want to dial it back a little bit to your military career,
Okay.
because you talked about all these changes that happened, right? And they weren't just changes from, moving from one service to the next, but you experienced all these changes that for a lot of people would have thrown them for a complete curveball. I mean, at any time someone experiences a physical change, i.e., like you can't fly anymore because your body physically is in a different place where you are no longer physically able to do this, or now we're in this job position that maybe we didn't envision ourselves in when we were in the military, and things might not go as laid out in one's brain. How did you deal with all those changes?
Frankly, I vacillated back and forth between trying to maintain a really positive mindset and of course handling them poorly in some cases, and that's part of that accountability that I've had to take now. But my dad was a military warrant officer. He was a helicopter pilot, and he flew 3 voluntary tours in Vietnam. So wrap your head around choosing to go back to that over and over again. And it wasn't just voluntary tours. He flew Charlie Dustoff, which for some people they would know that right off the bat. For other people, they wouldn't know. He was one of those guys that would come in with turbines whining and helicopter blades just chopping trees, skid across the ground, pick up 150 bloody people in 4 or 5 trips and drop them off and then go back for more, even though they were being shot at. And so that built a thought process of resilience in us all the way up until we were 9 years old and he died in a helicopter accident. We didn't have him anymore. So it was almost like building the perfect table setting and then tearing the tablecloth out from under it. Some of it fell and some of it stood. And for us, the thing that stood was not the stability that you could have by holding yourself together in crisis. It was more of the ability to rebuild the table setting after crisis happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, when my knees got tore up and they got nearly shattered, I spent some time. I was in the middle of a reclass school and I took off. I took my rental Mustang GT at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and I drove all over the battlegrounds in the southeast of our country. until I had to go back and face the music for having taken off. Luckily, I had some really, really good non-commissioned officers who understood what a catastrophic change it was and how to put that together. So they did something called an AMED, and they put me on a medical hold. And I went down to the reserves at that point. Well, actually, all the way down to where I was working National Guard AGR duty. And because I couldn't fly anymore, I was driving people's medical records and stuff back and forth on Fort Riley and delivering them to the different clinics and stuff and delivering medical samples. I even transported an organ or two once or twice. But it gave me a chance to refocus on the fact that I was by no means over, and that while I had wilded out for a little bit, it was time to get my head in the right place. So when I went back active duty in 2007, I was a lot more focused. And I knew a lot more about the fact that my value wasn't in what I did, it was who I did it with.
How was your transition out of the military once you were finally done?
I refer to that as basketball. It was dribbling. When I first came out, I oddly enough, my brother-in-law, he's in the next room over here, so he could probably hear a bit of what I'm saying. I went to work with him. We had made some arrangements over the telephone and digital meetings, as it were, up until that time to see if we can make a transition. And we worked together for about I want to say 9 months or so on a construction business. I ran marketing and occasionally ran one of the crews, and I did safety briefs for the guys that included how they could maintain safety when they were working on roofs and in other projects and equipment conservation and stuff like that. But it just didn't end up being a good fit. And so in true military fashion, I deconstructed pretty quickly. I was working weekends and evenings as a DJ at a local radio station that I actually got to officiate on the air for a small regional radio station the day that the Royals won their first pennant. So in 2015, that was an exciting little moment for me. I got to see a rural town turn all their light bulbs blue and go out and just like wreck the streets a little bit. But while I was doing that, I did some side work with my brother-in-law. I did some work in a couple of other places. I think just some odd jobs. And then I ended up working at a place called Wardcraft that builds site-built homes that are made to transport. So it's not like a mobile home or a manufactured home. It's built with 2x6s and everything in the outside, solid as a rock. Everything's done on it, and then when they deliver it, they set it down on a concrete foundation, bolt it onto the foundation, and put an iron I-beam in the middle of it, and it's there forever. And I worked there for 3 years. So I guess as time went on, I was starting to stabilize and see where some of the skill sets were important. Some of them were extraneous to who I was now, and I had to work really hard to stop defining myself by how many wow faces I could get from other people.
Did you feel like when you were in this period where you're just kind of figuring out work and life post military, did you feel like you were aligned with a passion or a purpose? Did you feel like it was draining? I guess my question is, what, if you can remember, what was your headspace like at that time as you were kind of switching identities or, lifestyles from what you had known for however many years prior to getting out of the military?
Well, I kind of have to retrograde back from that just a little bit to my last duty station. When I came back from Iraq, I would not say that I was angry at God per se, but I would say that we were on some troubled terms. I had a lot of things go on that basically took me clear out of church. And I stopped taking my family to church. We lived an incredibly abundantly worldly lifestyle all over the place, doing a lot of different things. We weren't shattering our moral compasses or anything, but we were definitely not paying attention to any kind of personal development or anything like that. So when I got out, one of the things I was not ready to do was jump into the church. And so I didn't have a stabilizing influence like that until I'd say a few months after I got out. And then I started aligning myself towards that understanding, which helped stabilize a lot of other things. I'm not going to say it was without emotional peril, because it was. One of the three worst and most emotional separations I've had from my family happened during that period of time. But as things started to solidify, it was more important for me to figure out how to build an identity in front of God and in front of myself than it was for me to build an identity in front of them. Do I adapt to make sure they're comfortable and happy? Yeah, that's part of my job, I think. But at that point in time, the guiding influence had to be accountability, and it had to be worrying more about something bigger than me.
Do you think that your experiences in Iraq had anything to do with this time period of your life where you said that things were just not ideally where you would have liked them to be? Is what I'm hearing you say, is that, you had things were on rough terms between you and your faith. And so I'm curious if Iraq had anything to do with that, or did you think that it was just all those things that you mentioned, everything kind of happening at one time?
One of the things I've learned in being a part of the mental health organization is that things rarely simplify to an easy either or, but I would say Iraq was a very significant presence in my mind that I was working extremely hard not only to ignore, but not to acknowledge altogether. I started group therapy at Fort Leonard Wood, was like 4 years, 3 or 4 years after I got back. Before that, I wasn't willing to admit any problem at all. And after I got out of the military, I bounced back and forth between whether or not I wanted to take the medications that they had prescribed me, whether I was going to be a part of any kind of counseling paradigm, whether I thought it was something I needed now that I wasn't confronted with the military all the time. A lot of it aligned down to the fact that until I was willing to admit a persistent presence of something other than myself in my head, other than the reasonable, rational self in my head, that I wasn't ready to rebuild anything of myself. I was afloat, but I wasn't swimming in any good direction yet.
And
Does that
so,
answer your
yeah,
question?
yeah, I guess my follow-up to that would be, because the direction you're kind of going here is like what was really helpful for you. And I think that this part of the conversation is really, really helpful for veterans that are feeling similarities here. Because I can relate to the space of, where things are kind of amok, right? Like there's the family piece of it, there's the piece in my head, there's the piece where like certain things need to happen before certain things can happen, right? Like if that's making any sense at all, the way I'm describing that, it all makes very much sense in my head. But what was really helpful for you? Because you talk about the group therapy piece, but how did you kind of get to, and this is kind of a probably long-winded answer to this question, so answer it the best you can. But you've obviously done a lot of work over the years to get from this place where things are essentially falling apart in your life, right? To this place where you can now say, I can take personal accountability for these things, and I can have a better understanding and talk about these like really somewhat horrific things that happened in your life, or very, I guess, a traumatic is the word you want to use, things that have happened in your life, and talk about it casually in a way that it's like, yes, these things happened, and yes, they are traumatic things, but this is what I did to mold myself into the person that I am today. And so, in the best way possible, if you could explain to us and the listeners how you got from point A to where you are now, like what was really helpful for you in that journey and process.
Well, like I started today, I am an unapologetic Christian. So I will coin an old Billy Graham phrase when I say, not I, but he whom I send messages for. I don't think that I was either qualified or capable of dragging myself from the mess that I had allowed my life to become. I believe that had I not had God watching over me, there are probably 30 or 40 times I would have been dead in my lifetime. And I can say that in the same tone that I talk about my traumas, because I've come to a point where I can look at them realistically without the patina of personal dishonesty. I still feel emotional connection to those things, but they have become a part of my history, which can inform a better future. And so I guess the things that helped me align were my faith for sure. Refining my faith and realigning with it and having a strong familial background of faith around me helped. There are some things that you just can't replace through artifice, and one of those is life's very easy way of putting our things or our messes in front of us. The Bible would say it as what is done in the dark will come to the light, and it does. When you mess up, it doesn't matter how many times you ladle dirt over the top of it and try and plant a petunia, eventually that petunia is going to come up mess up colored. And you're going to have to confront that. And the degree to which you confront it is oftentimes engineered through the amount of layers you tried to put over it when you were hiding it from other people. I learned that lesson the very, very, very hard way. One of the things I've always wanted to be known for was integrity. And I could straightforward look at you in the face and tell you what it took my wife and I 10 years to come to the understanding of. I turned into a liar, a bad one, and not a bad one as I was bad at it. Unfortunately, I was pretty good at it. I wasn't honest with myself about who I was. I wasn't honest with myself about who other people were, what things were going on around me, what things were becoming, and what things were falling apart. I became really good at painting the mental picture into a kind of forced reality that I wanted to see until it got so far out of my own control that I had to admit I wasn't in control the whole time. One of the most difficult things I've ever had to do was to look my brother in the face and tell him I was a liar. Another one was to look my pastor in the face and tell him the same thing. But had I not had the strength to do that, I likely would not be sitting here right now. I'd probably be in a box because I was tearing myself to bits. So my faith, my family, the ability to lean on those two things while I learned to readopt those values that I had inculcated in the military in a civilian way. I would say falling back on my military core values helped immensely to repattern myself to who I would need to become to not only survive, but to thrive and help others do so also. And the final piece of that, I think, would be the fact that God saw fit to keep my wife engaged and invested, because through all the dirty mess that we drug through and through the times when I really made serious mistakes, when we reunited, she did so with a whole heart. And she did so with a whole heart enough that I knew she was still there and invested, not like she was going through the motions. And that was the final piece, because having a person with whom you share half of your soul, that is, it's impossible to fall down. You have the other leg right there.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, how did everyone support you while you're going through that? Because it's one thing to admit and say, I'm a liar. And it sounds like to me that that may have been a huge catalyst or turning point among probably many in your journey. But how was that support for you? Did you feel like you were radically supported during that time when you were trying to essentially put puzzle pieces, maybe not back together, because you didn't necessarily go back to a person that you were before? You pulled values from what you had learned up to that point. But essentially, I guess my perspective anytime we go through these things as humans is that we are learning how to be someone that maybe we have never learned how to be before. And that journey itself can be very scary. And where I think a lot of people get stuck is that it's not going back. It's like learning something completely new. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what the support was like for you after you hit this point where you said, okay, I'm admitting to myself, and I'm not only admitting to myself, I'm admitting to two other people that I'm a liar and I need to do something different with my life.
So, in terms of radical support, you would have to think first about a perspective ability to recognize. And at the beginning, at the outset, while I was going through these incredibly hard emotional traumas, and that's what they were. They were almost as traumatizing as the things that happened in Iraq. I was having to learn to live with the fact that I had been my own enemy combatant. I did not have the capacity to recognize radical support at that time. At the beginning, I knew there were people who supported me. My brother prayed with me. He talked with me. He shared things with me. He and I had a kind of a level that was almost like a love-hate relationship. We could argue, fuss, fight, yell, come back and talk the next day, and everything was fine. We had very different ways of looking at things. And so it was at times really rewarding and at times really difficult to try to find something I would consider to be a radical support there. With my wife, it was the same. We had become completely different people at some point that was like really ill-defined back in my service career. We had become really different people that were looking at and for really different things. And so it was difficult, especially during the period when she separated, to find radical support there. But my brother was there. I mean, people were there, but my perspective was not. As time went on, I have felt a lot more support. I've felt it in the church among fellow believers. I've felt it at irrational times when I've been out and seen people in bad places and talked to them about finding pathways to recovery and recognition of where they could be, and saw gratitude and just a kind of a self-identification or a benchmark on their face that they had found a footrest on the path that made me look back at the way some things were in the past and say, yep, I was supported there.
Hmm.
I'm never a person that really likes to be trite, but the poem about footprints comes to mind. And the long and short of it is that when you look back at the pathway of Jesus and you walking down the beach, and you see that sometimes there was one set of footprints, and you're like, well, where were you when I was walking through that alone? Son, those were my footprints. I was carrying you.
Hmm.
That our perspective makes it so difficult to see outside of a single view plane. It's frankly really fascinating to me that through the annals of behavioral health science, they consider it still to be rare to find true narcissists. And I think the reason that rarity happens is because a lot of our human behaviors become homogenized. They start out as purist behaviors, but as you come into interaction with other people and other behaviors and thought processes and social cues that kind of give you the idea that you might not be doing the right thing socially, you might be thinking about just yourself. People have learned to dampen what really is a self-interested perspective. And trauma is no different. Trauma is a great liar. You are entitled to your pain and your hurt and the things that happened to you that changed who you were. But what you're not entitled to do is to take those things and utilize them as a bastion from which to build a weapon that you aim at other people. And unfortunately, that's what pain does in a lot of cases, is it weaponizes our perspective against other people. And I had to learn that many times before I could even understand what radical support really was. But I can assure you, I feel it now. My boss is an amazing guy. He allows me the time and the latitude to join veteran programs and programming and do things that are outside of my normal scope and job perspective all the time because it supports the veterans in our area. My wife, she's very much invested in a cooperative and collaborative view of our future, not only through our journey, but through Rough Redemption and its journey, and through the things that we have sitting in front of us that we're going to go into, even up to and including maybe someday the mission field, because she has she still has moments where she doesn't know and where a lot of things are overwhelming to her, but she's still all in. And that's radical support. When you divest yourself of your self-preservation instinct and throw yourself wholeheartedly at the idea of another person.
You bring such
Does that
an,
answer?
yeah, you bring such an interesting perspective to that word support. And so I remember when we were in peer support training where you and I met, and we had a discussion around support. That was one of the key pieces to peer support, is talking about this idea of support. And I remember me sharing with the group that it's hard for me personally to feel like I have support, even when I know I do, because it's like that feeling of, do I feel supported? That kind of grapples with this idea in my head that people are radically supporting me. And I think a lot of people are probably in this position, especially when we're talking about veterans or active duty, because we have to kind of look introspectively and look at the big picture of it. And we're all in survival mode at the end of the day. I mean, it's what, from a nature perspective, it is what our like core needs are, is surviving at the end of the day. So if we're constantly living in a survival mode, it's very hard to feel like people are supporting when, maybe we take things personally, or when you talk about the journey where you admitted I'm a liar and people were supporting you in the best way they knew how, or maybe they were going through their own emotions. Obviously I can't speak to what other people are going through because everyone has their own story in that part of even your journey, right? And so you kind of have to like place all these puzzle pieces together and constantly reflect. And I love the practice of reflecting, because when we can reflect on our lives, we can kind of look back at a situation at a different lens and say, okay, at that time, I couldn't see this. You said something like this very well. You articulated it so well. At the time, you couldn't see it because you didn't have the ability to. But now you can look back and you can see where you were supported in these different places. And I hope that if you're listening to this episode, that you consider this with your own story, is that we can at any time in our lives look back at situations where maybe we couldn't quite see something at the time, but now we can look at it in a different lens and say, oh wow, maybe this was traumatic, but this person that was trying to support me and help me, I didn't see it like that at the time, but now I can see it like that at the time. And it's going to look different for every single person. But I think just the practice of reflecting in general is such a powerful thing to do. And so thank you so much for sharing that in the way that you did. I think a lot of people are going to find a lot of value from really your entire story. There's so much that you've done. There's so much that you've been through and so much that you've learned along the way that, I think you and I could probably talk for hours more just listening to the value that you have to share within your own story. So I really, really appreciate it. I did want to give a little bit of time for you to talk about some of the resources that I know you had wanted to mention to the listeners that you think would be really helpful. So I'll give you some time to talk a little bit more about those.
So some of the resources that I've been able to tap into, actually, you shared with me a few weeks ago. The Growing Veterans Peer Support Program was very impactful, and I would recommend it highly to anybody who's going to work closely with veterans, or people that are affiliated with veterans, dependents and caregivers. Definitely, they tend to acquire kind of a side edge of veteran cultural competence that can sometimes take a little bit of investment to get through. Also, I recently attended the American Legion Be the One training. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. You can schedule yourself, and it deals with the Columbia Suicidality Index, but it shows kind of the humanization of it. When you're a case manager or a case worker, you work with, I guess, the 6 questions and the tiers. And if you have a yes in the first two, then you ask the next two, and then of course the follow ups and so on. And that becomes almost like a routine mini screen, when in reality there's an entire program behind it that mirrors partly the Army's ask, care, and escort program, and also in part some civilian offerings with regard to tapping resources that aren't traditional. Some of the other resources I've been able to make use of out here are the Kansas Department of Aging and Disability Services. KDADS does a lot of monitoring of programs that work alongside of mental health to create a holistic health picture. And we were able to get some of our programs and some of our work with developing cultural competence education sessions through to them, and then get a bit of buy off from them. And although I'm not at a level where I can just walk right up to the BSRB and say, certify my training, I was able to provide that training in front of people who are at that level. And so we've had session by session certification that has enabled people who require CEUs to function to be able to come and get kind of almost like a compensatory background from that. And as we grow the integration between civilian human services, mental health, and the CCBHC, which I think Washington is not quite there, but getting there, the Certified Community Behavioral Health Center model.
I don't know much about it.
Well, it's an integrated, holistic, physical, mental, emotional, and cultural health paradigm that fits everything together. It addresses everything from medication-assisted treatment and substance use disorder through culture shock and cultural differences, through PTSD and associated. A lot of people stop at PTSD, but then they ignore the fact that you've got ancillary stress, you've got generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and some of those are even developmental in the bipolar area, where you end up with manic depressives and things of that nature. But if you address only their symptomatology and not the etiology that comes behind it, then you're missing half of a person. And so being able to work with KDADS and being able to work into developing a program into the CCBHC model has allowed me to not only access resources, but indeed develop some of our own. It's very rare in a lot of states to see a civilian outside to be able to provide accredited veteran services to people outside of a VA hospital or like the American Legion, BFW service offices. But we offer them Monday through Friday, and we travel with our veterans through a 7-county area. And we do that, and it's sponsored by the state because of CCBHC and the programs we've developed. So we get the very fortunate benefit of being able to number ourselves among the resources we access.
That's incredible.
So some of the other things we get to do is we get to grow with our veterans too. So as new programs get developed and we learn them, we get to be the first ones out for training programs and stuff in the state and even federal level, but given at our state capitol. And there's a legislative sensing session that we get to go to yearly, where we get to put our priorities out there in front of the legislators who will be arguing back and forth over what's worth the money through that session. And so the more noise we can make around mental health and holistic health for veterans, the better that it becomes when it comes to time to allocate grants for the development of trainings like the one that we got to go to.
Okay, so Loran, I know there's some other things that you've been working on as well. Did you want to share more about that with the listeners today?
Absolutely. One of the things that I've found really probatively important with people is accountability. And I think that's been kind of clear throughout this podcast that it is important to me to see people's past and their honesty about it be important to them. As such, one of the things that my wife and I have done is that today soft launched a clothing brand that, I mean, well, let's be honest, everybody and their mother's pressing t-shirts nowadays. I mean, from DTF to sublimation to vinyl, it's hard to find somebody who isn't making their own t-shirt for a birthday party or something. But we aim to be a little more than that. Our brand is Rough Redemption. You can see it there in the little cue card in the corner of my camera there. There is contact information there for people who are interested in supporting or at least learning more about it. Our website will be launching sometime in the next 3 months because we want to launch as a whole instead of launching in stages. We want to make sure that the web store is functional and do all of our brand tests and stuff like that. But we've already started sales. We have some branded shirts, license plates, hats, stuff like that. Rough Redemption is really about one simple thing. For people who live in the faith, there's nothing simpler than the understanding that accepting Christ is salvation. And that's not a hard thing to do. What's hard to do is, one, convince yourself that that's all you need to do. And two, to get out of your own way. Because we put all of these strictures and thought processes on top of ourselves and all of these, I have to do this first, or I haven't quite finished this other thing and it might not be acceptable, so let me do it first and then I'll come back. All of these pitfalls that we put in front of ourselves, like the former difficulties in my relationship. All of the times when we thought, well, if I were more free than a saved person should be, what could I accomplish before I got to that point? And so we create a rough world for ourselves, and finding our path to redemption through that is difficult. And that's what this is about, because at the point when you realize that pure honesty isn't dangerous, it's essential. That's when you start telling people, ask me how I know. Ask me how I know that it's dangerous to drive 99 miles an hour on a motorcycle on a gravel road, because I've been there. Ask me how I know that it's dangerous to get into text message conversations with people that you probably shouldn't be having private conversations with if you're engaged or married to a person who is important to you. Ask me how I know, because I'll tell you. And in telling you, I will show you how I had a rough road through to redemption on the other side. And that's what our brand is all about. So that is something that we've been kind of kicking around. My wife has always been a crafter, and she always had some really serious leanings that direction. She loves literally every type of crafting there is, I think. But we've never really discussed or desired making clothing before this idea came to us. And it's become a real important part of us already. And hallelujah, we got a $70 launch sales today. That was
awesome.
Phenomenal.
Congratulations. I did want to ask, for those who can't see, what is the best way to find you and support you? And I know you don't have a website yet, but the information that you alluded to that is on the screen for those who are listening to the podcast.
Okay. They can email us at dj@roughredemption.com. They can shoot messages through partners like you or other people who are in the kind of military framework where we all get together and we talk. Eventually, those get back around to us. The fastest way is, of course, the email. And pretty soon, we're going to be putting up some web crawler things like order forms and stuff where people can actually throw requests in. And if it's something we can really get to.
Awesome.
And if it's something we can really get to, then we'll be glad to connect and work with that. And then we do have a parent LLC that my wife started last year, Uplifted P23. And it has its Facebook page, and we do a lot of information about our launches there too.
Okay. Awesome.
So uplifted P23.
And please, once the website launches, let me know so I can update the show notes, because I will go back and do that. And then all the information that you just said, I'll also throw in the show notes for anyone that didn't quite catch that, or, just wants to simply copy and paste. That will be there, and that will be updated as I get more updates from Loran about this. So congratulations on that. That's huge. I know that was a huge step for you. Just doing that, and really launching anything is a huge step, and it's a lot of work. So congratulations on the successful soft launch day, and wishing you the most success as you continue with this endeavor. Is there any other way that we can find you or support you? Let's say someone wants to work with you that lives in your area in Kansas, or in really any other avenue that constitutes one of the million things that you are working on in your life.
Honestly, another thing that is just a whole host of resource is liveconnectedks.org. That is our state SMVF website. It has virtually all of the information about everything from American Legion and BFW posts and service officers in the state to trainings and calendars about things that are upcoming. My Green Zone trainings are always on there, along with the next location and the times that we'll be serving there, because we have 3 different time selections that we use depending upon the comfortability of the host and the ability to gather people. Our next upcoming one is in Newton, and that is right by Wichita, and it'll be there February 16th, so right after Love Day. And we look forward to seeing as many people come that way as possible. We've already garnered a couple of permanent supporters in the form of Vet Links and the Bel Air Tactical Recovery Center, which is a veteran-focused and centered SUD recovery center that focuses a lot on the rough redemption model, about the accountability and honesty and standing back up. Not just talking about the fact that, hi, my name is Loran, I'm following 12 steps, I am an addict. But no, this is what I did when I was addicted, and this is why I know that I can't be that anymore.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that resource. And I hope if you're in or around that area of Kansas, or even surrounding states, if you want to travel a little bit, that you take advantage of these resources. And if you don't, share them with someone else around you, because I think the disconnect that I often find in the veteran community is that people know there's resources, they just don't know where to look. And that idea of like the Google search, the daunting Google search for what you need is so mentally taxing when you need the help. And so most people just don't. So resources that people are telling you about that someone might need, super, super helpful, and really helps so many people. So thank you so much, Loran, for sharing all that information. Like I said, I'll post
remember
in the show notes. Go ahead.
Back in the 90s, when it was first rolling out, the whole internet searches and Yahoo and everything else, and I think it was like 4 or 5 years after the search engine really got big, and they had like Dogpile and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they talked about the information overload, and they had the cartoons of the guy that would like start searching for a yellow tie and end up with buttercups and all this like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the end of it, he's searching for a doily for his oven.
Yeah, it still happens to this day.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm definitely there. I've told people at the VA, it is not about treating veterans like they have less intelligence, or about coloring things in crayon for them. I mean, sometimes the Marines want that, but that's not everybody. Space Force. But no, the place where it really gets down to is we were taught to tactically acquire information with the least amount of risk and the most amount of gain possible, and then apply it to actions on the objective. So the first thing we're going to look for is the least difficult way to find the most resources possible. And if we make it through 5 or 6 entries on the list, I'd be shocked. Because by the time we're getting to 3 or 4, we're like, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
So making the resources accessible and then intercommunicating with them so that they create a network, that's priceless.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing not only a little bit about your story and what you are doing now, but also other resources that aren't your resources, but will help other people. That is so invaluable to the people that listen to this and will listen to this episode in the future. So thank you so much for that, Loran. Are there any last words or pieces of advice that you want to leave the listeners with today?
Honestly, just these three things. You may be tired. You may be disinterested. You may have been disenfranchised by the things around you, but nothing should ever take away your desire and ability to just reach out, because truthfully, God only knows what you'll contact in the dark when you put your hand out there. The second thing is the skills and abilities that you are granted through the time it takes to train you and to equip you to function in a role, whether it be one that has a lot of value in the civilian world, or whether it seems to have lost its value when you lost your hand receipt. All of those are able to be repurposed. To allow yourself to devolve into a point where you feel like you have no use in this life anymore is to construct a building of depression around yourself, one that only you can open the door and walk out of. So find a place, invent a place, create and investigate places where your skills and abilities will be functional, not as an intrusion on other people or a way to tell them you're better than them, but as a way to support and invest in and improve the communities that you've chosen to place your lives in. And then in the last place, I'm a Christian, and I've made no bones about that. I know where I place my faith. But my strongest piece of advice out of all of these last 2 and 3 is find what you have faith in. Invest in it. Put yourself into it and find what pours out of the other side. Because what you pour your faith into, that's what's going to save you when the darkness comes.
Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.